Good morning. Hi. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the University of São Paulo for the invitation and for giving me this opportunity to share with you guys some of the stuff on which we are working. I present myself before start. I'm José Paruelo. The last point that doesn't work, so I'm gonna take the old-fashioned. I'm José Paruelo. I work in two universities, in Buenos Aires, in the University of Buenos Aires. This is the logo. In the College of Agronomy, in an institute that is part of the University of Buenos Aires and the CONICET, that is the National Council of Scientific Research. And I also have an appointment in the Facultad de Ciencias in the University of La República in Montevideo in Uruguay. So I'm jumping from one another side of the Rio de la Plata. I have a hard time trying to figure out sorry, I will be coughing all the lecture because I got a flu, and so I still have some of the leftovers of the flu. I have a hard time trying to figure out the content and the title for this talk class, whatever we're going to call it. I end up with this, trying to discuss with you how to assess the sustainability and vulnerability of socio-ecological systems. And I like it because I put in the center this idea, the socio-ecological systems, and we're going to be linking this idea of socio-ecological system with these two other stuff. This idea of sustainability, a controversial concept, and vulnerability. And how we're going to be doing that? Introducing this idea of, or this framework of ecosystem service to face one particular dimension of global changes, the land use and land cover changes that we are experiencing all over the world, but particularly, I will focus particularly on Latin America. Most of what I'm going to be presenting today is part of the work of many other colleagues, graduate students, investigators, that work together in this project, Bridging Ecosystem Service and Territorial Planning, that is a CRN project, a collaborative research network funded by the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Studies. Let's put it in the presentation mode. Well, so my goal is to discuss this idea of ecosystem service supply as a way to assess the sustainability, and I put in quotes, and vulnerability of socio-ecological systems, and the approach that I propose to take for achieve this goal is to discuss briefly the idea and genesis of the socio-ecological framework, to focus on a particular dimension of global change, land use and land cover changes, and I want to stress on understanding how, or the drivers and the consequences of these changes. And finally, I wanted to explore ways in which we may get this concept of ecosystem service and turn it operative for assessing sustainability and vulnerability. We're going to see how can achieve this goal and and how it works. Some warnings. First, I'm going to have, I know that you are a pretty diverse class, people from all over the world, and here I will be having a clearly South American perspective, and the focus will be mainly in two ecosystems, in two biomes, more than an ecosystem. The Chaco area, xerophytic forest, subtropical xerophytic forest, and a little bit less on the grasslands, a biome that is called the grasslands of the Rio de la Plata, more temperate type of biomes. The other thing is that many of the examples and the illustrations that I will be presenting are based on models, remote sense, more or less sophisticated statistical techniques, and sometimes this kind of overshadow one important thing that is natural history. And I don't want that this thing happens. I want to keep in mind that natural history, Darwin, Humboldt, Bonpland, are those that are providing us the basis to come up with this idea and actually to understand how biophysical systems may work. The other thing is that I will focus a lot on land use and land cover changes. It doesn't mean that there are other dimensions from contamination, from climate change, of course, that are less important. It's just putting a focus on one of these dimensions. And the other thing that is very important for me is that, please, if you have questions or comments, stop me and we can try to answer or discuss these issues. I leave some time at the very end of the talk to have a discussion, but if you think that it deserves, feel free to raise the hand and we can discuss that. The first things that I want to do is try to make a brief history of how we move from this idea of ecosystems to this other concept, the socio-ecological systems. Of course, I assume that you are well familiar with the idea of ecosystems. No? The interaction between the biota and the physical work, and the ways that we use to characterize those ecosystems. If we make a little bit of history, the ecosystem concept is not something that is with us for a very long time. In the 20th century, this guy over there, Tansley, I forgot the first name of Tansley. Tansley. My friend Tansley introduced the concept, and then this guy, Lindemann, Raymond Lindemann, in the 40s, when he was 24, something that is a little bit embarrassing for all of us, come up with this idea that it was the base of what we keep doing on ecosystem science for the rest of the 20th century and for what is and the part of the 21st century. It's the idea of energy flux, that there is solar radiation that is captured by primary producers, and that this goes through a herbivory change, and this herbivory change interact with the detritus change and the way that and the energy flows through this system. These things get a bit more formalized and complicated by Odum. Where is the over there? We got a grandchild of H.T. Odum that formalized this in this that we call the flux of energy. Energy coming from the light, from the sun, that is captured by the autotrophic level, that dissipates part as heat, parties respire, and we come up with this critical piece of, or critical variable that is the primary production, the total carbon gains that of an ecosystem, the enter of energy that get available for the next trophic level. And this idea was, and still is, very important to understand what's going on. Actually, to manage ecosystems is, if we put it in terms of energy flux, is operate on these boxes and operate on these kind of channels, fluxes of energy, open or closing some of these fluxes. HTODUM, that was a critical character in improving this idea of energy transfer into ecosystems, take a critical step on linking this idea of ecosystems and socio-ecological systems. He introduced this type of diagrams. We don't want to get into the details, but aside from considering the environmental system, the physical ecosystems, start to make connections with the economy and with the main economy, and start to formalize the interactions, the energy that goes from natural systems into the main economy, and how the main economy provide resources, mainly fossil fuels, in different forms, to open or close some of these pipes that connect autotrophic labs. And this was a major lab, a major step in connecting the physical or biophysical world with the human dimension of the world. The importance of this was to start to think on subsidies that we incorporate into the ecosystems, to start to think on renewable and non-renewable resources that are within the system and that we import from outside the systems, and from characterizing, quantifying these fluxes to derive a number of indices that tell us a lot about the sustainability of a system. For example, what is the ratio between this yield in terms of energy and this flux, the amount of energy that we incorporate from outside the system. This idea of ODUM was extremely important, still is important, to understand how the interaction between the biophysical world and the human dimensions work. I like my thing, so sorry. It's a way to put aside the natural history. No, that's something that, well, let's get technological. So a next step was this idea of socio-ecological systems that start to appear in different places in the 21st century. This is a paper from Charles Redman that is actually an anthropologist, but very well connected with the ecological world, that formalized this integration between the ecological components, the primary production, the dynamic of population, the dynamic of organic matter, of nutrients, the disturbance regime of a systems, with the human components that incorporates not only the economic dimension, but also dimensions that actually the schemes, diagrams of ODUM didn't capture very well. Demographic aspect, cultural aspect, institutional aspect that shape this relationship between the human component and the ecological component. In the middle of actually the interaction between these two components are related with a lot of issues that are those that particularly capture our attention in environmental science: land use and land cover change, production, consumption, and disposal of residues. Of course, this dynamic is influenced by a lot of other factors outside the systems. There are, on one side, conditions, constraints derived from the political and economic arena that probably influence more the social patterns and process than the ecological patterns and process. And there are conditions, biogeochemical conditions, that probably influence more the ecological side of this diagram. The socio-ecological system idea got a lot of formalizations. Now, we love to make diagrams, and we always think that a diagram misses some part that we think that is important, so we keep doing new ones. Of course, there is not such thing as the perfect summary of the concept in a diagram, because it's a model, and a model, by definition, gets stuff outside the representation. There is another one that I like from Chapin that again define a boundary for the system, a very important conceptual issue to define what is inside and what is outside the system, a limit, a boundary that is clearly dynamic and depends on the definition, the problems. What are we trying to tackle when we study or when we try to operate on socio-ecological systems? And what I like on these schemes is that, of course, got a biophysical and human dimension side, got the interactions, incorporate the human actors, the stakeholders, but separate both the human and in the biophysical dimensions variables that operate with a high frequency, we call it fast variables, that you may change relatively rapidly, and slow variables, those variables that are very hard to change. It's very hard to modify the cultural tides or the land tenure or the infrastructure. In the same way, it's kind of hard to change the disturbance regime or the total carbon in the soil or the functional types. It's relatively simple to modify the soil nitrate or an individual event of a disturbance process. The other interesting thing is that of this scheme is that incorporate the external control associated with different spatial and temporal dynamics. So there are factors influencing the dynamic of the socio-ecological system that operate at different temporal and spatial scales. And this is critical when we try to formalize the structure and the functioning of an ecological, socio-ecological system, because, of course, the relative importance that we'll have on the dynamic will change. And I got one more, this is the last one, scheme of the socio-ecological system that is also from Chapin. Well, it's also from Chapin. It's built from many other stuff that are going around, but I took it from a book from Chapin that, again, put some on the ecosystems, define the dynamic as the interaction of different types of capitals that we may characterize in socio-ecological systems. We characterize the natural capital. The natural capital will be providing this other important piece of knowledge that we were talking, that I was talking about, the ecosystem services. The human capital, basically the capacities and the abilities of those that are part of these systems. The social capital, that is not the same than the human capital, that is related with the ability, the capacity of the actors, the people that live there, of acting collectively. So the getting together and doing something. And of course the infrastructure, the built capital, that include also the money, the financial capital. The interaction of these different forms of capitals define the dynamic of the socio-ecological system and define one important characteristic of several important characteristics of this system. One is the sensitivity of these systems to some external factors that may operate on them. Of course, the vulnerability will be derived from the degree of exposure of the system to these particular factors, but the sensitivity will define the vulnerability. How the magnitude of the impact that the system will experience when an hurricane, changes in the prices of the commodity, or whatever we want to put here as an external driver operates on the ecosystem. The interaction of these forms of natural capital also define an important characteristic of the system, that is this one, the capacity of learn, the adaptation capacity, and the capacity to innovate in front of changes that operate on the systems. This dynamic in turn define the vulnerability, the adaptability, and the resilience of the system. The resilience understand as the capacity to keep being the same when an external driver, a disturbance, operate on the systems. So, if we look at the system, the vulnerability, the adaptability, the resilience, and the transformability will be defined the ability of the system to persist. It will keep being a subsistence systems based on raising goats and cows. The chances of the systems to get transformed in unintended ways. That means get degraded to something else that we don't want as members of the socio-ecological system, or the possibility to transform the systems, to move the system to something else that we like, that we decide as a society that will increase our chances to provide different type of services and in turn benefits for the different actors, members of these socio-ecological systems. Where are the land use and land cover change? They're there. They are in the interaction of these forms of natural capital. They are related to the sensitivity. They will be affecting the sensitivity of the system to external drivers and will compromise or improve the capacity of innovate or adapt the system to these external drivers. Let me change the presentation to Libya all these presentations. I don't know if you have it. Oh, perfect. And some papers that are referred in the very bottom of the slides if you want to keep exploring this idea. So let's go to land use and land cover change. And and as I told you, I will have a South American perspective, and particularly those are the biomes of South America, and I will concentrate my attention on mainly this orange area that corresponds to the xerophytic, subhumid forest of what we call the Gran Chaco, an area that extends from Bolivia to central Argentina, incorporate a big part of Paraguay, and also on this yellow one that are the Rio de la Plata grasslands. This is a kind of boring area. This is extremely flat, very, very flat. Now, there are very, very few mountains there. We put it outside because it's something else, it's something different than the rest. And except for this part of the Rio de la Plata grasslands, Uruguay and southern Brazil, the Rio Grande do Sul, the landscape is extremely flat. This defines most of the things that happen in this area. One is that it's very easy to transform it because you don't get huge or important slopes. The Chaco, this is a zoom in the area, including the Bolivian, Paraguayan, and Argentine Chaco, got a gradient of precipitation. Precipitation is higher in the eastern part and actually decrease to the center of this Chaco Seco, start to increase again on the west area, and you see that got a pretty large latitudinal gradient from 20 more or less to 36 or 37 degrees, no, 33 degrees in the southern part of the area. And it's a pretty diverse area in terms of uses. There are cows, there are pastures, there are subsistence systems, and there are people living there. It's very hard to try to understand what is going on with the Chaco if we don't start to incorporate the different actors, the different stakeholders that shape the changes in this area. How it looks. I don't know. How many know the Chaco area? So, this is a picture. I know how well represent what you know from the Chaco. It's not very nice forest. Getting in there is tough, it's thorny, it's hot. Usually got a herbaceous layer and a multistrata woody component with shrubs, trees from different height. Some of them emerge from the canopy. There is one, just one, that we may say that define the whole Chaco from Bolivia to middle Argentina is in Spanish, the quebracho blanco. If you got quebracho blanco, you are in the Chaco. That's more or less the message. And in there, you get people. The Chaco area is pretty diverse in terms of ethnias, aboriginal ethnias. Those are witchy women, but they are Matacos, Tobas, Quom, a lot of ethnias, quite different, Guaraníes, quite different in their origin, in their culture, in their way of living, in their livelihoods. And so we got there a very complicated thing that is not just, say, Aboriginal people. It's something more complex and more diverse, and we need to understand this complexity if we want to understand and operate on the system. There are also some other actors that are getting a pretty huge transformation of the landscape. Those are areas that you see first. You see how flat this is. No, you don't see any mountain, any relief there. And in this sea of xerophytic forest, you start to see islands of crops. Those are related with a new actor that get incorporated in the area. Again, it's a pretty diverse actors. They are local people starting to do agriculture, but there are also people coming from outside the region to operate in the area, living there or living outside there. The main actor is associated with this machine, a caterpillar that need to get rid of the forest to start to do agriculture or to sow pasture for the livestock. This process starts by removing with very aggressive techniques the forest. They got caterpillars that get changed and move through the forest, removing all the trees. Those trees get, they make, how do you say in English, cordones. They put in together all the dead material, and finally they end up putting fire on this. This is the most common, I will say 95% of the transformation of the Chaco is associated with this pattern of removing the vegetation and setting fire on the residues. So in this area, the transformations associated with land use changes modify in a very dramatic and extreme way the structure and the functioning of the system. This is a picture of 93 of an area. I will tell where it is. This is the Rio Paraguay here, and this is the Rio Paraná. No, this is the Rio Paraguay. This is Paraguay. This is Brazil, and this is Argentina. And in 40 years, in 30 years, this is what happened with the forest in Paraguay. Basically, disappear. Changes were not homogeneous. You know, the transformation in Brazil occurred before this date, and it never happened in Argentina because it is an area with a national park and with the different type of protections normatives there. So there is a huge change. The change includes this new piece of land cover, a dam. This is Itaipu. And these changes represent also changes in some other stuff. On one side, we got a pretty huge increase in the production of commodities, different types of commodities, and we got a reduction in the supply of services and goods, from control of soil erosion, the production of greenhouse gases, the loss of biodiversity, etc. The transformation that get these forests, well, in some way are common for other areas of the world. I make a parenthesis. I was saying that I will talk on the Chaco, and this is a particular area, and I took a particular case to generalize. There are many Chacos in the world. The xerophytic forest is not a characteristic of just this part of South America. You get the Chacos in Africa, you get Chacos in Asia, but you don't get the same social, you may get the same biome, you get a quite similar ecosystem, but you get a different type of social ecosystems. For example, and I'm still on the parentheses. We analyzed with a postdoc what happened with all the Chacos of the world in terms of a variable that some variables that we can characterize from remote sensing. So we don't need to go to India, Kenya, or Bolivia to make the study. We can do it from our offices. And we look at primary production, and we look at the amount of energy that is captured by this forest that is lost by fire. And we got a pretty interesting issue. First, that, not surprising, the xerophytic forest release a very high, in some cases up to 30% of the carbon gained as fire. The energy is dissipated as fire. This is a huge amount of energy. Actually, there are some countries in the world that from this energy, and taking into account all the efficiency factors that you need to put in behind, can get all their supply of electricity out from this energy released by fires in xerophytic forests. This is a kind of amazing, surprising thing. But there are also some xerophytic forests that got zero amount of energy released by fire. Why? They got the same climate. They are basically the same plant functional types. They are all these thorny hardwood type of forest. The difference is in the people. In India, there is no way that one single branch that get from the tree get into the ground, it will get immediately on a stove for cooking, because the density of people and the cultural characteristic make a huge difference with what happened in other areas of the world. For example, the South American Chaco. So there is a very important ecosystem variables that define a lot of interactions between the surface and the atmosphere that is mediated by human, and is mediated by population and by cultural aspect of this human population. Close the parenthesis. So the type of transformations that we get in the South American Chaco include two things. On one hand, the forests get a modification basically by the introduction of domestic herbivores and by logging. So this is the more historical, the type of transformation that those systems experience during most of the 20th century. People get cows there, and people get from the forest timber. I don't know if, at least for the South American in this room, perhaps you are aware of the importance of one species, the other species of quebracho, the quebracho colorado, that provide most of the tannin that was used into in the leather industry. And this determined a pattern of use and exploitation of the forest during the first half of the 20th century that shaped the structure, also shaped the structure of the socio-ecological system in the Chaco, both in the human and in the biophysical dimension. Now, the xerophytic forests are mainly experience a conversion. That means that the system is replaced almost completely by first this type of cover that are pastures based on African grasses from different excuse me, from different genus, Panicum, Cencrus, Brachiaria, and by crops. Again, different type of crops. There is one that accounts for most of the area, and it's soybean, of course, as you may imagine. This is a description. Those are anecdotal stuff are related with land use changes. We need a way to formalize the way we study these land use changes, and also how we study, how we understand the factors that drive the changes and the consequences of these changes, both in the human and in the biophysical dimension. And I will go back to some schemes and diagrams to formalize this stuff. We may imagine that we got systems that got a normally it's not a good term, I put it in quotes, is the original, the most common in the past, so normal in terms of the most frequent, structure and function. And there is a dynamic that modifies the systems and generates systems with an altered structure and function. These changes derive from a dynamic of a set of stress and disturbance factors that move the system from here to here, and some passive or active activities of restoration that eventually move the systems on this direction. Of course, the frequency, the strength of these arrows quite different. This arrow is way more important in terms of area that experience the change than this other arrow. The important thing here is that associated with this system, the one that gets these normal structure and functions, are benefits that people can get. Some of these benefits are private and some are public. And there are benefits also associated with these systems. And it may happen that the relative importance of those that are private and public may change. And of course, there are stakeholders, there are actors, there are people over there that perceive these changes in a very completely, in a very different way. Being red or being blue here determines that you may see this change as a catastrophe, or you may see this change as a blessing. No, you talk to people that say deforestation is the most important issue that is going on, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. and you talk to a guy that produced soybean, this is fantastic. You see the development, the amount of job that we are creating. So that makes the issue of this dynamic particularly complex, because it's not such thing as a problem of deforestation. You know, problems are a social construction, and it depends on the values and interests of the people that are there. Basically, if you are red or blue in this scheme, no? Without any connotation on what it means, red or blue here. The other thing is that people here operate on this arrow. So the changes are not independent on the stakeholders. Those stakeholders may promote, avoid some of these changes. This dynamic is determined by the stakeholders that got a stake on the benefits that the system generates. But of course, there are a lot of external events, and there is also a context, political, technological, cultural, social, that determine the possibilities of these changes. For example, the same external factor and the same external stakeholders may not promote the same changes without, for example, OGMs. No, in English, GMOs, genetic modified organisms, because the possibilities of transformation is associated with having a technological package on which the GMOs are a critical piece, aside from other stuff. There is two possibilities. I'm being extremely clear, or you are completely bored, or so be free of asking questions or make comments, because I'm getting nervous about this.
I'm curious, in this Chaco region, based on the information that you know about this system, how it was used by people in the past, in the distant past, because it seems like people were occupying this land in the past, and you use normal in quotes. This is how the forest looked in the past, but to what extent is that true? To what extent was this region occupied previously?
The main use in the Chaco, most of the ethnias that live in the Chaco are not agricultural people. So they hunt and gather stuff from there. The Huichis, the Matacos use basically the products of the forest, and they don't have any particular crops. So the crops are clearly up in the mountains. The Incas were those that were agricultures, and on these plains, agriculture was not a major issue. And the relative importance of the resources that different ethnias use varied. Varies because the Chaco is also heterogeneous. There are some rivers crossing the Chaco, and that defines particular cultures there. But if I have to say one important thing about the use in the past, is they were not agriculture, just little spots, but it was not an important issue. There are no crops from this area, so maize, potatoes originate in some other areas of South America. So, on the dynamic of this, let's go back. on the dynamic of these systems, this in the middle, right there, is land use change. This is what is driving the dynamic of the system from this normal to this altered type of functioning. So we need to put land use changes in the middle of the our concerns on the dynamic of the systems. It's what is shaping the structure and function of these socio-ecological systems. And we need to understand first what are the drivers that operate to determine changes in land use and land cover, both in the human markets, both at the local and the global level, policies, the availability of technology, the development of technology, the social structure, greed, that is another important dimension or factor in the human dimension, and also the biophysical drivers, how soils, the biota, or the climate set the possibilities for land use changes. And we need to understand, once these drives operate on the area, what are the consequences, both in the human dimension, how the production of commodities change, how this affects food security, food sovereignty, quite different issue than food security, income of who, no, the reds or the blues stakeholders, how it affects the cultural values, how these changes generate conflicts, environmental or territorial conflicts, and how operates on inequalities at the level of the society. And also how these changes have consequences on a number of factors of that what we call ecosystem services, the water provision, the regulation of the atmospheric composition, the hydrological regulation, biodiversity, the ability of sequestering carbon, etc. This is not a static system. The consequences operate on the drivers. So when this change, the way that the drivers operate on changing the land use get modified, and also there are some interactions between the human and the biophysical dimensions. The technology determines that the restriction imposed by climate or soils may change, and the cultural values will determine that the change in the provision of a particular ecosystem service magnified or get reduced in its importance. I will use this scheme to kind of make examples of how we tackle the study of these of a socio-ecological systems like the Chaco. So what we need to understand to operate over these systems. And basically what we need to do first is describing the changes. This may sound obvious, but for this area we don't have a clear and complete idea of the changes that had been operating. And this is a major problem, because if you don't know what is going on, if you don't know the patterns, it's very hard to understand or derive hypotheses on what are the factors that are operating on determining the changes. And of course, you cannot get idea of the consequences over the human or the social demand. So describing the changes is a major issue, and it's not something that we got completely solved. Mainly because there are some temporal and spatial scales related with this point of describing change. The other thing is that once we get the pattern described, we need to build hypotheses on how these drivers operate. Because why we need this hypothesis? Because from this hypothesis, we may start to operate in the systems. We need to make projections. We need to help in the device of policies that may accelerate or decrease the rate of changes. The other thing is that we need to quantify the consequences. We need to identify what are the dimensions that I listed there as consequences that are more important, and how these dimensions change when the system gets transformed, a particular land use increase or decrease. And the other important issue is that we need, and this is probably the most challenging issue, is trying to understand, to evaluate how the consequences feedbacks on the drivers that are operating in the systems. And what I plan to do is to go through this, well, is to show how in our group or with people that work close to our groups, tackle these issues in the Chaco area and in the Rio de la Plata grasslands. They are the only ways to tackle this? No. There are others probably better, but they are examples on how we can get an idea of what is going on with these four aspects related with the dynamic of this system. The first thing I was telling was to describe the changes in land use, land cover. And we may start at very different levels. Let's start globally. And globally, we see that the lights are hiding some letters. The agricultural land per person change through time. For this period, the first decade of the 21st century, what happened for the world, for those countries with low, middle, or high income, that the land per person get reduced. We got less land available for growing food, energy, fibers, whatever we want. If we get these countries, those with low and medium income, we see that for most of the regions of the world, the East Asia and Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, there was a reduction as the global pattern in the area, except for Latin America. There is the only area of the world where this area, the agricultural area per person, increased. And if you look with some more details, there are 5 countries, I will say, in the world where the area, the agricultural area per person, increased. Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia, the Chaco, and the Rio de la Plata grasslands. Uruguay is not part of the Chaco. In the other Latin American countries, there was a reduction. There are 2 possibilities. Either the numerator increase or the denominator decrease. There was no reduction in population in any of these countries. Probably those are not the countries with the highest population growth rate in the world, but they're still growing. What happens is those areas concentrate the highest rate of transformation of native vegetation into agricultural areas. Actually, the Chaco got the highest rate of deforestation in the world. There is some controversy because it depends on the scale where you measure, but if you measure at the level of region, clearly it's the most, it got the highest rate of, of deforestation. What moves a little bit the focus from the rainforest that got a lot of attention, and I'm not saying that it's not important, deforestation in rainforest, but there is a Cinderella biome, I will say, because it's not iconic, that is experienced the biggest change, the Chaco. And I was saying the problem is that we don't know very well how these things are operating. So we need to describe for this area the changes in land use and land cover change. But we need to do in a way that the patterns that we get can be or need to be based on protocols that we can repeat in space all over this area and need to be repeated over time, because we need to keep changes in the future and we need to get an idea what will happen in the past. So that is a challenge, even for those that used to work with remote sensing technique and technique for classification and so on, because one problem that we face is that how we get an idea of the cover of forest in 76. We cannot go there and check our classification, do what I teach the course of remote sensing in my school, say, well, you have to go get ground truth and check your predictions based on a map. No way. This happened in 4 years ago. We don't have the time machine. We cannot go there. So we need to devise approaches that can tackle this. And actually, the only one that we can use is visual interpretation. We need to get an idea from inspecting visually remote sensing or aerial photograph to come up with a description of where these systems get a major structural change that we perceive as a clear change in the tone, the color, the patterns in a visual representation of an image. And, no, this one no. And Maria Vallejos worked with a team of students to look at all these Landsat scenes over 30 years. I don't know, were more than 800 images to come up with an idea of where deforestation occurred and in which year this deforestation occurred. So we not only know that this is deforested, but also we know when it was deforested. So we got in a detail an idea of these patterns, areas that still have forests, areas that were deforested very recently, and areas that get deforested 40 years ago. And she did that for the whole Chaco, and that provides a way to start to describe how the patterns of land use operate in the areas. because the patterns were not the same. The rates of deforestation varied across this huge area. The patches deforested got different shapes, got different forms, got different sizes. For example, in Bolivia, in Paraguay, or in Argentina. And having this information permit to have an idea of what is going on with the process of deforestation. For example, a relatively simple but important issue is that if you calculate the annual rate of deforestation, that means how loss in relative to what we have over time, one important thing is that the rate is still increasing. It's not that we have a high rate. Both for Bolivia, for Argentina, and particularly for Paraguay, we have an accelerating rate. It was 0.25 in 86 in Paraguay. It's 2.5 now. We don't know what is the other, but we're going to start to make a projection of what's going on. And we also may start to have an idea of how looks the patches that get transformed in this process through time. For example, here we got again the time, and here we got the mean plot size that get transformed. So what is the size of a patch that get deforested and get transformed into agriculture? And we see that for Argentina there is an increase in the mean size of the patches. In 76 it got 45 hectares. Now it's almost double the size of this plot. The same happened, well, actually it was more important, the increase in Paraguay, but in Bolivia it decreased. What is going on behind this? Actually, we have an interesting, I will say, experiment here, because the regulation, the cultural and traditions, and the type of stakeholders operating in this area are completely different. Clearly is the agribusiness companies here, they are Mennonites. The Amish people in Paraguay doing this. They are indigenous or Japanese colonies in Bolivia, that determines that the way the system is transformed is different. And we are starting to capture these differences. So we are getting a pattern that start to, or permit to start to develop the hypotheses that are behind these changes. What are the drivers or the factors that determine the changes? And the important thing on this is it is impossible to see for this area everything. No, we can look at the mean size of the plot, the rate of deforestation, and so on. One important thing, we believe, is to have many people working, looking at this data, and building this hypothesis. Why? Because we don't know the whole reality of this huge land. It's almost inaccessible for a single scientist, moving around, talking to many people. So that's why we devise a system with all this information is available, and we are starting to have actually we already have some papers from people that we don't know that are starting to use the same database. So we don't have we eliminate a source of variation. It's how we calculate or how we estimate the changes in land use. We eliminate this because we got the same database, and we start to look at different patterns, process, and more important, hypotheses on what is going on behind the changes in particular areas. A province of Argentina, a department in Bolivia, or in Paraguay. The other important thing with this, let me check the time. The other important thing with this is having the possibility, by tracking the change through time, is to understand the dynamic of the system. Does it change it through time? Keep it constant? What are the regularities? What are the differences? And what we can learn from these dynamics to project the future. So José Volante, that works in the province of Salta in Argentina, summarized these informations for these 3 periods. This integrate what happened in the 70s, in the 80s, 90s, and the beginning of the 21st century, and come up with a very simple classification of the land. If it was agriculture, if it was native vegetation, or bird soil. Bird soil correspond to areas, particular areas. I was telling you that this is a very flat area, very flat. So what happened with the rivers here or here is that cannot get in a very clear cause. How do you say causa in English?
River bed.
Yeah. So it may diverge on a large area, generating bird soil areas because it gets flooded. Then the river moves to some other places. This area that gets flooded and then added with bird soil get covered again, and so on. And the other thing that happened in areas where there are no rivers, mainly the Provincia de Santiago del Estero got just one river there and nothing else, is that you got arachid or endorachid basins. And associated with this basin, where water goes nowhere, but actually goes to the lowest point of the landscape, is you start to get salares, salines, that are pretty important in the area that covers. And those are what we call bird soil. They got also a dynamics, because it depends on the movement of the rivers, it depends on the water that flows into these endorachid areas, and so on. So that's the way that José Volante characterized the landscape. Just 3 classes, very simple. And from this characterization that is over there, he can derive the transitions. What changed to what? For example, most of the area experienced no change. It was native vegetation. It keeps being native vegetation from 77 to 87 or to 87 to 97. Some areas experience change. Bird soils get into agriculture, native vegetation get to agriculture, agriculture to bird soil, and so on. With this, you may start to compile the information and get what we call transition matrix. So something that was in the first period vegetation, native vegetation, what is in the second one. If you count how many pixels or cells are experience the same change, you get this transition matters. Basically, we do what we always do in frequentist statistics, that is using frequency as a way to estimate probability.
Which ones the land uses? Vegetation, native vegetation?
Native vegetation, agriculture, or bare soil. And from this transition matrix, or well, this the same transition that can get an idea of what land cover increase or decrease, we can build models, dynamics models, that tell us what are the models that are allowed to make projections of what's going to happen with the landscape, based, assuming that what happened in the past will keep passing in the future. And so Jose estimate this change. First, get rough numbers. The loss of native vegetation was 21%, and the gains 3.6. The changes in bare soil were more or less even, and it was a huge increase and almost no loss of agriculture. More important, you can build these diagrams that tell us what are the transition probabilities among the different states. These greens are the native forests. The red are agriculture, and the yellow one, excuse me, are the bare soil areas. So we can, based on the frequency of pixels or cells that change, calculate what are the probability of transitions for the 3 periods analyzed. For example, there is a probability of 90% that a patch of forest keep being a patch of forest. But there is a probability of 0.05 that get transformed into agriculture, or more or less the same that gets into this category of bare soil. And we see how these probabilities change through time. For the 3 periods analyzed, how this probability of transition changes. Well, in some cases, this is not the probability of transition, it's the results of applying this probability of transitions in terms of area that get converted into agriculture. And this one was dominant in 2 periods. It was not dominant in this period. The transition from native vegetation to agriculture. And another parenthesis. I didn't warn you before. There are some slides or some graphs that got some Spanish name. Sorry. I didn't have the time, or I forget to change it. For example, in this case, it's not native vegetation, sino vegetación nativa. Sorry. And these other 2 transitions are the other 2 dominants. The transition from native forest to agriculture, and the transitions to native forest to bare soil. The other 2 are completely marginal. They are very, very small and represent a relatively minor portion of the total area. And this is, well, it's a description, I like it, we learn a little bit more. No. There are some political issues or policy issues very important associated with this understanding. And we're going to get back to this at the very end. But let me introduce a keyword. That is the idea of forest transition. You heard about forest transition? Forest transition is an idea developed in the northern hemisphere that describes the process that operate in the 20th century where areas that get deforested to do agriculture that were mainly marginal or not very productive get with the technological development that makes more valuable other lands get abandoned, and we got a recovery of the forest. So there is a transition from forest to agriculture or pastures and back to forest. And this is the idea, the possibility of getting forests from areas that were agriculture behind a model of use of land that is the land sparing model. You heard about land sparing? This idea that kind of confront land sparing. We do very high-tech agriculture here, and we leave this area for conservation, versus land sharing. That is, we got a level of an intermediate level of transformation, and we try to compatibilize or using together, having a multiple use of the landscape. So this is the first evidence that in the Chaco, or at least this is the Argentinian part of the Chaco, forest transition is not taking place. So there is no agriculture to vegetation transitions quantitatively important. The other thing that we may learn from this is what are the, because as I told you, the Chaco is not an homogeneous forest. There are different types of forests. Actually, there are some other vegetation types, shrublands and grasslands. What are the type of forests or type of native vegetations that are more threatened by the agricultural transformation? Which are preferred and which are avoided? Those are preferred are the xerophytic forests and the grasslands. The rainforest and the shrublands are those that are avoided. So the focus on conservation, we need to keep taking care of the rainforest, but attention, put some efforts on those vegetation types that are the more threatened by the transformation of the landscape. Finally, I was telling that we can do some projections. And again, these projections depends on how much we believe in our estimates, that our estimate of the transitions will be held in the future. That means we observed this probability of transitions in the 80s. Well, now things changes. We may doubt about this. So with this in mind, we can look what is going to happen in the region in the next 2 centuries. And we can look at this or we can do these projections using the transition probabilities for this period or for this period. If we use the transition probabilities for a period that go from the end of the 80s to the 90s, we see that the proportion of, this is the proportion of forests, this is the proportion of agriculture. It will take 1 century to get a landscape that gets more or less the same proportion of forest and agriculture. In the landscape, we cannot tell clearly what is the matrix and what are the patches. We may have a system with more or less the same proportion. If we use the probability, the transition probabilities derived from the most recent data, these numbers go from 100 years to 40 years. So the process of acceleration of the rate of transformations move the change in the landscape 60 years before, 60 years to the present, the transformation. Is this true? I don't know. I have no idea. Probably things will change. Actually, we know that change in the past, because the results that we obtain using different things are not the same, but set some limits. In a few decades, I don't know if 3 decades or 10 decades, the Chaco landscape will be completely different than now. The proportion of agriculture and forest will be the same, and this start to generate some caveats related with how this will impact on other things that we care. Yes. Yes.
So you don't need to consider previous time steps, the history of the change in this particular place, or it's not important?
This is I will show you then other approach to solve this. This is the most crude approach. This is it's a first level approach that tells you this is what we see in the past. Let's check what will gonna happen if things remain as in the future. Probably we need something more mechanistic. So we know that many of the factors that operate here change: prices, technology, regulations that we impose. Let's see how we incorporate this in making the projections. Now we got this, and I keep the question, and we'll see it later. The other thing that we can understand, and this is not derived from this crude description on native vegetation, agriculture, and bare soil, is if we open the box agriculture, is see what is the dynamic of the transformation. When a forest get transformed mainly in what? Most of the first transition is to ranching, to a pasture of an African C4 grass. From there, they move to a simple crop, 1 crop per year, and then to double crop, with these transitions or with this intensity. The other interesting thing is trying to understand what are the dynamics. Some double crops can move into single crops. Some simple crops get back to ranching. Ranching areas with grass, C4 grasses may move to double crops. We don't see a significant arrow going back to dry forest. So we got that, and I was, before you ask the question, I was making a comment about why we do this exercise. Now, if we know that it's not true. Actually, it provides the basis for thinking on scenarios on land use to explore some other important issues. For example, how this new landscape will interact with the atmosphere. This new landscape got different albedo, got different exchange of momentum, energy, and mass, and got different spatial patterns. How this will interact with the climatic system. And this is an important issue to incorporate, having information in devising new scenarios for some other issues. For example, exploring the local climate or exploring some social relationship between different stakeholders. We're going to see. It's 10:30, and I'm very rigorous with time, so we're going to be we're going to have a break, and we're going to follow with the next point that we're going to discuss.